So here's a question that literally every single one of us will eventually have an answer to. What really happens to your body when you die? And I'm not talking about the philosophical or spiritual aspect, though we will touch on some fascinating near-death experiences later. I'm talking about the actual anatomical and physiological cascade of events that occurs in your body during the process of dying and in the hours after death. Because your body doesn't just turn off like flipping a light switch. There's a whole sequence of events that happens, some of which are extremely fascinating. So today we're going to cover these events, talk about what we do know, what we don't know, and as I already hinted, touch on some of the unexplainable events at the end. It's going to be a departed one. So, let's jump into this anatomical and physiological awesomeness. So let's start with what happens in the moments leading up to death. Now, obviously, death can occur in many different ways: cardiac arrest, trauma, illness, cancer. But regardless of the exact cause, there's a common pathway the body follows once certain critical systems begin to fail. And so, let us use cardiac arrest as a primary example since it's one of the most studied scenarios. When your heart stops beating, blood is no longer being pumped throughout your body. Remember, blood is delivering oxygen and nutrients to all of your cells, particularly to that very demanding organ sitting inside your skull, the human brain. Within about 15 to 20 seconds of your heart stopping, you lose consciousness. This happens because your brain, which makes up only about 2% of your body weight, but uses roughly 20% of your oxygen supply, is immediately starved of that oxygenated blood. The neurons in your cerebral cortex, the outer portion of the brain responsible for consciousness, thought, and awareness, starts to shut down almost immediately. But here's where things get interesting. Even though you're unconscious and your heart is stopped, your brain does not instantly die. In fact, research shows that measurable brain activity can persist for a short period of time after the heart stops beating. Several studies have documented organized electrical activity in the brain for minutes following cardiac arrest. In some cases, EEG recordings have shown brainwaves continuing for up to 10 minutes, although this activity rapidly becomes weaker and more disorganized over time. A 2023 study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences observed a brief surge of gamma wave activity at the moment of death in a small number of patients after life support was withdrawn. Gamma waves are often associated with processes like memory retrieval, information integration, and conscious awareness. However, it's important to note seeing gamma activity does not necessarily mean a person is consciously experiencing these events. It simply shows that certain neural networks can become briefly active during the dying process. But how is it possible for brain activity to continue at all after the heart stops? Well, one reason is that neurons don't run out of energy instantaneously. While neurons do not store energy in large reserves, they do contain very small, rapidly turning over amounts of ATP that are already in use at the moment circulation stops. Neurons also contain a small amount of phosphocreatine, which can briefly buffer ATP levels for a few seconds when energy demand suddenly spikes. In addition, neurons can temporarily rely on anaerobic energy pathways such as glycolysis that do not require oxygen. Also, supporting cells in the brain called astrocytes store small amounts of glycogen, which can be broken down into lactate and shuttled into neurons as an emergency fuel source when blood flow is lost. However, all of these backup systems are extremely limited. Without oxygenated blood, mitochondrial ATP production rapidly collapses. Ion gradients across neuronal membranes fail, and normal electrical signals break down within minutes, which is why prolonged cardiac arrest leads to irreversible brain injury and death if blood flow and oxygen is not quickly restored. But these short-lived energy buffers may help explain why organized brain activity can briefly persist after the heart stops. And they may also contribute to some of the vivid experiences people report during near-death states, which again we'll talk about in more detail later on. Now, while your brain is going through this process, the rest of your body cells are also beginning to die, but at different rates. Your brain cells are kind of the divas of the human body. Neurons begin to suffer irreversible injury within about 4 to 6 minutes without oxygen, but other cells are more resilient. This is because many of these cells have larger glycogen reserves, lower overall energy demands, and a greater ability to rely on anaerobic metabolism when oxygen is no longer available. Skin cells, for example, can survive for several hours after death. And believe it or not, some cells in the body can remain metabolically active for days. In fact, studies have shown that gene activity in certain cells, such as certain white blood cells and muscle satellite cells, can still be detected up to about 96 hours after death. But just like the neurons, these cells eventually reach a point where they can no longer generate enough ATP to maintain normal function. Ion pumps begin to fail. Calcium floods into the cell, destructive enzymes are released, and the cell essentially begins to digest itself from the inside, a process known as AIs. During this dying process, there are also physical signs that medical providers look for. The skin may become pale or take on a bluish tint, especially in the extremities due to the lack of oxygenated blood, and this is called cyanosis. Breathing patterns may also change dramatically, and in some cases, providers observe a pattern called Cheyne-Stokes respirations where breathing becomes irregular with periods of rapid breathing, followed by periods of no breathing at all. Body temperature begins to drop, though. Interestingly, in some cases, there can be a brief spike in temperature shortly before death. The pupils of the eyes become fixed and dilated because the muscles controlling them are no longer receiving signals from the brain. And in many cases, there's a release of urine and stool as the sphincter muscles relax. Not the most distinguished aspect of death, but it's the reality of the physiological process. Now, earlier I mentioned that phosphocreatine can help buffer ATP supply when a neuron is starved for oxygen during the process of dying. We all wonder about it, don't we? What actually happens when we die? It's one of life's biggest mysteries. Today we're going to pull back the curtain on this universal question, exploring both the known science and the fascinating unknowns. Let's start with what we can observe. Let's say someone has just been declared clinically dead. Their heart has stopped, they're no longer breathing, and there's no detectable brain activity. So what happens next in those first few hours? First up is something called algor mortis, which is just a fancy way of saying the body starts to cool down. Normally, our bodies maintain a steady temperature around 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, thanks to all the metabolic processes humming along. Once those stop, the body begins to match the temperature of its surroundings, cooling at a rate of about 1 to 1.5 degrees per hour. This rate isn't set in stone, though. It can change based on things like body fat, clothing, and the environment. Forensic scientists actually use this as a tool to estimate the time of death, but because of all those variables, it's more of an approximation than an exact science. Next, we have livor mortis, also known as lividity. Since the heart isn't pumping anymore, gravity takes over. Blood begins to pool in the lowest parts of the body. So, if someone dies lying on their back, you'd see a purplish-red discoloration on their back, buttocks, and the backs of their legs. This process usually starts within a few hours and becomes fixed after about 8 to 12 hours. Fixed means if you press on the skin, the color won't change, and it won't shift if the body is moved. This is another clue for investigators. If the lividity doesn't match the body's position, it suggests the body was moved after death. Then there's the one most of us have heard of, rigor mortis, the stiffening of the body. This is all about what's happening at a cellular level in our muscles. To contract a muscle, tiny protein filaments called actin and myosin bind together. But to relax the muscle, you need energy in the form of ATP to unbind them. After death, the body stops producing ATP. For the first couple of hours, the muscles are actually relaxed because there's still some leftover ATP. This is called primary flaccidity, but once that ATP is gone, the actin and myosin get locked together, and the muscles become rigid. Rigor mortis usually starts in the smaller muscles of the face and neck within 2 to 6 hours, then spreads to the larger muscles. The body reaches peak stiffness around 12 to 24 hours later. Interestingly, rigor mortis doesn't last forever. After a day or two, the body enters a phase called secondary flaccidity. The ongoing process of decomposition starts breaking down the muscle proteins, which causes those locked filaments to release, and the muscles relax again. Other changes are happening too. The corneas of the eyes become cloudy within a couple of hours, because the cells that keep them clear stop working. The skin might develop a marbled look as bacteria spread along the blood vessels just beneath the surface. And even though you can't see it, decomposition begins at the cellular level almost immediately. The real visible signs of decomposition, caused by bacteria in our gut-producing gases, take a bit longer to show up, usually over the next few days. But let's shift gears now to something truly mysterious: near-death experiences, or NDEs. These are profound psychological events that happen when someone is on the brink of death, or believes they are. This can be during a cardiac arrest, a traumatic injury, or even under anesthesia. What's so fascinating is that even though every experience is unique, they share common themes across different cultures, ages, and backgrounds. People from all over the world describe strikingly similar things. Research has identified several core features of NDEs. One of the most common is an out-of-body experience. People report feeling like they've separated from their physical body and are watching things happen from a distance, often from above. Some have even reported seeing specific details of their own resuscitation that later turn out to be accurate. How this happens is a huge area of scientific debate. Dr. Sam Parnia's AWARE study found that about 40% of cardiac arrest survivors remembered some kind of experience, though many were fragmented. About a third of people who have an NDE report moving through a tunnel or a dark space, often towards a brilliant light. This light is described as warm, loving, and unlike anything on Earth. For most, the experience is overwhelmingly positive. Around 80% report feeling immense peace and unconditional love, so much so that many don't want to come back. However, a small percentage of NDEs can be distressing. Many people also report meeting other beings, often deceased relatives or friends. Interestingly, who they meet often aligns with their personal, cultural, and religious beliefs. Some experience a life review, where they see significant moments from their life replayed, sometimes from different perspectives. Others describe reaching a boundary or a point of no return, a place they know they can't cross if they are to return to their body. So, what's really going on here? We know the brain doesn't just switch off like a light. We know that brain activity can continue for a short time after the heart stops, and in rare cases, even show brief surges of activity. The release of certain neurochemicals could also play a role in creating these experiences. This might explain some aspects of what happens during an NDE, but there's a lot we still don't know. We can't fully explain how someone can have a detailed, coherent experience when their brain is supposed to be severely impaired. We don't know how some people report accurate perceptions from a time when they were presumed to be unconscious. And we don't know why these experiences have such similar themes across so many different people and cultures. So, while we have a good grasp on the physiological changes that happen to the body after death, the question of what happens to our consciousness, to our sense of self, remains one of the most compelling mysteries. Whether near-death experiences are the brain's final, beautiful fireworks display or a glimpse of something beyond, they challenge our understanding of life and death. And maybe that's the point. Maybe some questions are meant to keep us wondering, exploring, and thinking, right up until the moment each of us finds out for ourselves. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this as fascinating as I do, please hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the human experience. See you next time.